I'm going to reveal to you the new and everlasting covenant. Now, and by the way, if you don't obey it, you're going to be damned. All right. Okay. Joseph's going, you got my attention. Yeah. What is the new and everlasting covenant of marriage? And the question is it polygamy? Well, verses 19 and 20 give us the answer. The verse 19 begins, if a man marries a wife by my word, by proper authority, they live worthily. Shall they be gods because they have no end. They are set to their exaltation and glory in all things. Here we find described a monogamous couple who are being promised exaltation based upon being worthy and sealed by proper authority. That's why I keep coming back to this authority thing.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. This is part 2 of the episode I'm doing with Dr. Brian Hales on Was Joseph a Polygamist? Go back and watch part 1 because we did quite a deep dive where Brian has 3 main questions that he is asking towards those who deny that Joseph was a polygamist, and provided, I think, quite thoroughly a lot of data and evidence to support that Joseph Smith was a polygamist, both contemporary accounts, later accounts, people who stayed in the church, people who left the church as well. So go back to that one for a thorough analysis. But me and Brian, we're deciding to do a second part, and we're going to be addressing a lot of questions that listeners have. Maybe a few about the historical practice, but we'll maybe be getting into more like scriptural or doctrinal questions or arguments against polygamy or some things with Doctrine and Covenants 132. And Brian has kindly said that he's going to address some of these things as well. Anything you want to say before we dive into this, Brian, on part 1?
No, I would just say that about 10 years ago, I shifted over to researching the origin of the Book of Mormon, and that is a lot more fun.
Definitely. And there's so much to the Book of Mormon as well. It is fascinating, and it's never ending because there's so many different things you could learn about the Book of Mormon. And one of the books that I really enjoyed reading was Grant Hardy's on the Book of Mormon. I read it over summer, and what was really nice is that sometimes we try to use the Book of Mormon for, like, apologetic arguments or addressing criticisms, but he was just like, let's set historicity to the side. If you want to believe it's fictional or ancient, let's just dive into the text. And it really opened up the complexity of the text, the richness, things that I never seen before, the different editorial styles as well. It was really fascinating. So the Book of Mormon, there's so much more to it than what first meets the eye.
Well, I have a book coming out, but the editing's going kind of slow. Next year, 2025, hopefully, but 26 maybe, I don't know. But it'll be fun to talk about just those things you referenced. So
Yeah, well, and we'll definitely bring you back to talk about
great.
that when your book comes out. Okay, so let's see. We're gonna just go over some listeners' questions, and just some of these are rapid fire. So some of this you've kind of already addressed, but I'm just gonna compile this into kind of one big question. Some people ask, why are there many of the accounts from either wives or the accounts of, like, the angel and the drawn sword? Why do they come so late? Why don't we have more contemporary accounts of the angel visiting Joseph and contemporary accounts of the marriages and sealings to Joseph? I think you did in your last presentation, you had one of the lots that I think was contemporary. But basically they're saying, why is this coming like 25 years after the fact, the angel and the drawn sword and the marriages and sealings to Joseph Smith? What's your quick response to that? You kind of already addressed that, but
Well, and we kind of did. The reality is that these things were not written down until the RLDS Church was organized in 1860 and sent missionaries to Utah in 1865, 67, 69. And the church is now having to document things that people pretty much knew and took for granted. And so they're doing that, and so that's why there's this big delay. Now, with respect to the angel and the sword, what we have is a reference. I think there may be more than one. I wrote an article on this, and it's in Mormon Historical Studies. You can link to it if you go to josephsmithspolygamy.org. Go up to over to links, and it's there. But I've put all the accounts there. There are 22 or 23 from 9 individuals who knew Joseph Smith. Some of them may have been secondhand, like Eliza Snow. I'm not sure she heard Joseph say it. She may have just been quoting Lorenzo, who did. But the point is, if you look at there are rumors in Nauvoo that an angel is involved with the restored practice. Hiram, before he's converted, I think it's Hiram, he said that if an angel from heaven were to command polygamy, you would be able to see its cloven foot, and you would know it was from the devil. And so we have this reference to an angel teaching the doctrine. Of course, it's from a kind of a negative source. Hiram becomes the champion. The number uh, before Hiram was converted over in the middle of 1843, Brigham was kind of the go-to guy, but then Hiram took his place and was more involved. But so we do have some references that are contemporaneous of an angel being involved with the restoration. The earliest account, if I remember correctly, is from the early 1850s. Okay, not even a decade later, if I remember right. Maybe it is a little over, but it's from a non-Latter-day Saint source that does mention an angel and a sword being involved with polygamy. Not a perfect account by any means, but there were people talking about an angel and a sword being involved with the restoration. So we kind of do have a little bit of evidence, but the reality is we don't have much of anything until the saints start pushing back against the RLDS position in the late 1860s.
Okay. Um, so this is kind of maybe a more obscure criticism, but somebody asked this, and if you're aware, address this. If you don't know the specifics, totally okay. But they asked, I'm gonna maybe lump these two together. So they're talking about that Brigham Young, when he was on a mission, that he might have received some sort of revelation about polygamy, almost indicating that this came before when Joseph was supposedly practicing it in Nauvoo. And then they've also gotten Heber C. Kimball's mission journals. He talks about washing feet and going to bed with women. Do you know much about that? What's your thoughts on that? I've heard of this. I've not looked into it, so I can't speak to any details on this.
Um, I haven't looked at it specifically, except that Brigham Young did say that he knew nothing about polygamy from Joseph until after he got back from England. But he did relate that he received personal revelation that made him think on the topic and perhaps even made him prepared him to accept it.
Mm.
And this is kind of important because Brigham is the person who later on said that Oliver Cowdery had entered into polygamy in the early 1830s without authority. And yet there's no evidence for that. I wrote an article on that idea too. I don't think Brigham's right because he said he didn't know anything about polygamy before he got back in 1841. So he
And
wouldn't have been
Oliver seemed
privy to
very opposed
Oliver.
to Joseph's relationship with Fanny Alger, believing it was adultery.
Yeah. So I don't think there's anything there. Now, I'm not sure it was Heber who was having people wash his feet. Was it William Clayton? Could you be
The
conflating those two
person
names? Is it
Possibly the
Heber?
person who wrote the question said Heber C. Kimball, but I don't know if they're
Hmm.
accurate or what source that is. So I'm not sure on that one.
Okay. I thought it was William Clayton, but so what? I mean, what does it mean? It's like this idea that this the we have missionaries who are apostles, some of them who are teaching the Cochranites. The Cochranites are doing some weird stuff with marriage and cohabitation. It isn't Old Testament polygamy. What the Cochranites are doing, it's just, it's a new marital form that is against the law, incidentally. But so they think that Joseph is getting the idea for polygamy from the Cochranites through the apostles, but the Cochranites aren't practicing polygamy. But then they seem to forget that the Old Testament has Jacob with 4 wives by our standards, and Abraham has at least 3. And we can, yeah, I mean, if he wants to do polygamy, all he has to do is look at the Old Testament and introduce this as a restoration of Old Testament. Why this whole Cochranite discussion is, to me, is such a red herring because
Mhm.
it isn't polygamy in the first place, and two, if Joseph needed the idea, it's staring him in the face in the Old Testament. So anyway, sorry, I kind of moved off topic a little, but
That's
that
fine.
Cochranite discussion is out there as well.
Pops up now and again. So one argument I'm going to move more towards like doctrinal or scriptural arguments, sort of against polygamy. I watched in one video by polygamy denier, sort of arguing that the Book of Mormon, and we could probably talk about Jacob 2:30, but sort of like Jacob's sermon to the Nephites, sort of calling them to repentance for their practice of having wives and concubines, calling it whoredoms and abominations. Also, the story of Noah having wives and concubines, that being considered like abominable and sinful in the Book of Mormon. And then this mix with like Joseph's revelation and the 1835 statement on marriage. So they would argue that the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, so the scripture Joseph produces, is very much consistent that it's sort of condemning polygamy, and therefore D&C 132 is like an anomaly or contradiction. What would you say to that if they were to argue that the Book of Mormon Doctrine and Covenants clearly condemns polygamy as an abomination?
Yeah, this is not uncommon among the denialists. And they want to recruit the argument that polygamy is so bad. And let's face it, it's not easy. Monogamy, a husband and wife, they share things. They have this exclusivity between the two of them. They share that. And if you bring in another wife, that exclusivity, it fractures that foundation. And no longer can the husband be exclusive with one or the other. I mean, I've read accounts by people, the fundamentalists, and how difficult it is for the husband to be fair to the plural wives, but you can't really have that same level, I would argue, of exclusivity with any of the wives without harming maybe the relationship of the other, and it becomes a problem. So I find polygamy would be extremely hard. And I'm only sealed to one person. Somebody accused me of having three wives. I've been divorced, not sealed to her. I was married to Laura, and my current wife is a widow who's sealed to her first husband. And so I'm a monogamist in eternity. And I just can't imagine, though, the idea of polygamy, either here or there. But let me also say, there have been books written about how we should fear eternal polygamy, how women are victimized by our teaching that in eternity there may be some polygamous families. And just to say that we just don't know anything about eternal marriage, and so we can't judge what eternal plural marriage might look like. I mean, in that realm, we have infinite resources, infinite time. God can infinitely love all of his children. So could that love be felt infinitely by spouse? I mean, these are questions we can't answer. But should we be afraid of the ghosts of Mormon polygamy, as it's been phrased by some? I would say no. We're promised eternal joy, a fullness of joy, if we are worthy. And these things will take care of themselves. And worrying about something we do not understand is just a waste of worry in my mind. Let's trust God and the promises of eternal happiness and just work on staying in the covenant path. Sorry, getting devotional again on your podcast, Stephen, but it really is a real concern for women, and I understand why it would be. But we can believe the promises. We don't have to fear these things we don't understand.
But with regards to the argument about they sort of argue the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants, they would say it's consistently condemning
Yeah.
of polygamy and it's not sort of justified in the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants. How do we make sense of then Doctrine and Covenants 132? What would be your response to that? Like, would you see that the Book of Mormon is completely damning of polygamy as an abomination?
No,
Or
not at all. And though it comes back to verbiage. We have the condemnation in Jacob 2, 27, but it talks about in verse 30 that the Lord may raise up seed. If I will, the Lord says, raise up seed unto me. I'm quoting it poorly here,
I will
but
dwell
there
my
is
people.
what has been traditionally interpreted as a loophole
Hmm.
or a condition that if God wants to raise up seed, that he could allow or command polygamy. And that's how it has been interpreted in the past. Joseph Smith never mentioned that, by the way. I searched for it. If you look at all of Joseph's teachings on this topic as related later by people, because we have only section 132 that's a primary document, but we have other people telling them how Joseph introduced polygamy to them. He never mentioned verse 30 where it says we could raise up seed.
I think there's
And the
even one
reality is,
source, one document when the angel comes reported by somebody that he almost turned to the Book of Mormon to almost say, hey, it's condemned. So either Joseph didn't interpret it or maybe didn't notice that scripture in the Book of Mormon, Jacob 2, verse 30.
Um, yeah, he didn't use that, but see, this is a nuanced teaching because it the denialists will say polygamy is just too bad. God would never command it. Joseph was too good a guy to do it. And it's bad, so I know Joseph didn't do it. I mean, that's kind of the argument. The problem is once somebody accepts the idea that polygamy is bad in any situation, and then they discover Joseph did it, they become disconnected in their ability to believe in Joseph, perhaps. But I believe the Book of Mormon does have a loophole. For if I will, saith the Lord, raise up seed unto me, I will command my people, otherwise they will hearken unto these things. Now, I understand, I've had a linguist tell me that this is not a loophole, but I think early leaders did read it as such, and that's how I interpret it. I think the most obvious reading on this is that God could command it to raise up seed, which is exactly what we believe happened with the Latter-day Saints in Utah, that they did increase the number of people being born in these families. And again, I'm aware that in a polygamous family, the wives have fewer children than in a monogamous family. But when you have polygamy in
Collectively, there'd be more.
the society grows more rapidly. There are more children born because there are no women that are not having children. So I'm aware of that argument again. So I'm saying that no, there is a loophole, but I'm also we need to be very clear because I think people go beyond the evidence on this. The Bible does not condemn polygamy. It reports situations where polygamy is practiced that turn out very badly for the people who are participating. And we get all of that, but the reality is it does not condemn it. And so no matter how we want to wrest the Bible, we can't get it to say polygamy's bad because it simply doesn't. And then we do have Christ who's talking about the Levirate law, which is where a woman's dies, and I'm sorry, a man dies and they don't have any male offspring. So the man's living brother is supposed to marry her
Right.
and raise up seed to the deceased brother. If the brother that marries the deceased wife, the widow, is already married, then he has two wives. So that's polygamy, bigamy.
And that
And
was under
and
the in the law of Moses, levirate marriage.
yeah. So you have an example that's accepted by Christ, at least as being a legitimate form. At least he doesn't declare otherwise when that form of marriage is being discussed by with the Pharisees. So, and there may be many explanations to try to discredit this, but we do find Abraham, and I know there's talk about, well, this is before his name is Abraham, it's Abram, and he's doing polygamy, and I don't find those arguments very persuasive because Jacob clearly had two wives, two concubines, by our standards, four wives. I don't know what argument, many explanation is trying to discredit this as at least a version of marriage that God is allowing or tacitly approving. But you really can't make the Bible say that polygamy is bad. And there's several, observations to show us that it could be commanded or at least permitted at times, by God.
I've heard Christians the way that they try to make sense of it, who would say condemn and not believe in Joseph's polygamy, but have to acknowledge that polygamy was practiced by many of the patriarchs and prophets in the Bible. Some of them have said, okay, God sort of permitted polygamy in the Old Testament. It was sort of like part of the culture. They would also say it was never really a great thing, but they sort of argue that even if it was like permitted, we don't have any biblical precedence for it being commanded, sort of calling into question then, and maybe it's a bit of a non sequitur. It doesn't mean that God can never command it after, but they would sort of say because he's never commanded in the Bible, why would he command it, for Joe Smith to restore it?
Well, there are lots of people who want to use natural logic to judge supernatural events. And that's what we're dealing with here. If God wants to command something, how can we use our natural logic to judge that he never would without an example? So I don't find those arguments to be particularly compelling, but the naturalist will latch onto them oftentimes and find them very compelling. So
Hmm.
what do you do?
I remember, I think it might have been John Bradley I was listening to, who actually has changed his view, not reading Jacob 2:30 as a loophole, but I think he still holds the view that that doesn't mean that it couldn't have been later revelation. Joseph still could have later receive the revelation and commandment, even if someone doesn't interpret Jacob 2:30 as a loophole. I tend to read it similar to you. That's how I've always read it growing up. But even still, it doesn't mean it definitely couldn't be. So these next couple of questions are more criticisms of Doctrine and Covenants 132. I'd just like to get your take on this. So the Book of Mormon seems to condemn David and Solomon's practice of polygamy, having wives and concubines, so that the Book of Mormon people were trying to almost justify having many wives and concubines because of what was written concerning like David and Solomon. So it's sort of presented in the Book of Mormon as like being abominable in the sight of God. But then people would point out in Doctrine and Covenants 132, the Lord says how he like justified David and Solomon in their polygamy. So they would say this seems is this contradictory? The Book of Mormon seems to be condemning polygamy, but then Doctrine and Covenants 132, the Lord is almost justifying David and Solomon in their polygamy. How do you make sense of this? Some people might take the view that Scripture is not inerrant, so there can be contradictions. Is this a contradiction? How can we make sense of this?
Well, the people that find it a little confusing are, and I'm in the same camp with them. I think the verbiage that we're finding here has some ambiguity, if not contradiction, because we find God is condemning many wives and concubines, but then God is saying, no, the ones that were given by proper authority were okay. It's just when these men decided to marry women without the approval of what we would consider today, based on 132, the one man who holds the keys of sealing. They're marrying wives, with freelance sort of, and that is the condemnation. It's not the institution of plural marriage itself. It says in verse 39, David's wives and concubines were given him of me by the hand of Nathan, and who had the authority. And of course, David sinned with Uriah, but he also condemns the wives that were not given by proper authority. So
Hmm.
I think it comes back to that issue that polygamy itself is not bad, but that the unauthorized use, and to my friends who are Mormon fundamentalists, and I have quite a few, and there's a lot of wonderful people who are trying to live plural marriage today. My message is D&C verse 132 verse 18. We've got to have authority. You can't freelance plural marriage, and that's what's being done today, I believe, because people trace their authority. They say there's authority in Lauren Woolley or Eldon Kingston or Adele LeBaron or something like this. I've studied these lines. I don't believe their stories. I would encourage all of us to study and then pray. Don't just pray. Don't hear the narrative, but study whether Lauren Woolley is worth putting your salvation in his hands, because I don't think he's reliable. And this is the problem. You've got to have authority. You can't freelance it. In verses 8 and 18 of D&C 132, it says, my house is a house of order. Verse 10 says, will I accept at your hands that which I have not appointed? How does he appoint it? Through the one man. And so David and Solomon, to get back to them, they're taking wives without proper authority, and that is where polygamy becomes sinful. And that is what God is
Hmm.
condemning. But I admit the language there isn't as clear as at least for me, as it might be.
And I think as well, there's a scripture in the Old Testament, might be the book of Samuel. You'll probably know the reference better than me, but I believe it's after David sins with Bathsheba and after killing Uriah. And I believe it's Nathan saying to him, like, the Lord has given you, your master's, wives. Almost the language seeming like he was authorized in the plural wives he had, except for in the case of Bathsheba, Uriah's wife, and that he sinned in this. And then with Solomon, like he went on to have like hundreds of wives, and a lot of them caused him to then go after the worship of other gods as well. So one might wonder if that's perhaps what the reference could be in the Book of Mormon to that. But I can understand like why some might read that and find it confusing, or it seems almost a bit contradictory.
Right. And there seems to be a statement against it in one place, but in D&C 132, we find that no, sometimes polygamy can be okay if the one man holding the sealing keys is allowing it, that kind of thing.
Okay. What do you make of Isaac being lumped into the list of being a polygamist? Because people would say in Doctrine and Covenants 132, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, as well as like David, Solomon, Moses, are referred to as being polygamous, but then they would say in the Old Testament, he's not referred to as a polygamist, but why is he referred to it in the Revelation? How do you make sense of that?
Well, you can't prove a negative generally. You can't prove he didn't have it, and we just don't. The historical record doesn't tell us about it.
Mm,
It isn't a strong argument because you're arguing from negative evidence or lack of evidence.
right.
So I don't ever call Isaac a polygamist. When I'm referring to Old Testament polygamists, I just restrict it to Moses, Abraham, and Jacob because I don't think that why open that can of worms?
Right.
We've got others that we know were Abraham was a friend of God. He was a polygamist. So
And the last point, because yeah, you're right. It's not mentioned in the Bible, but doesn't mean he definitely wasn't. You're saying could be trying to disprove a negative. Uh, the last point people have pointed out, and again, this might be a similar thing. In Doctrine and Covenants, it talks about Abraham being like commanded to practice polygamy and take a plural wife. But then they would say, but in the Old Testament story, it seems to be very much Sarah who is the one encouraging him to take Hagar to wife to bear a child. So again, they would say the author, the Revelation D&C 132, is contradicting the Bible story about who told Abraham to take another wife. What's your take on that?
well, I see ambiguity in the language of Section 132 that there was commandments, but exactly what were those commandments? Were they to the verse that gets me is the one is go ye therefore and do the works of Abraham, enter into my law, and ye shall be saved. Well, what law? Is polygamy a law? It's been referred to that, but I don't believe polygamy is a law, or we'd have it in the Book of Mormon by the very righteous people that were there. But the works of Abraham were many. I mean, he did a lot of things. He paid tithing, he made offerings, and he also was a polygamist. But see, those two things, you can't freelance an ordinance. Remember, to obey is better than sacrifice. Was it Saul went out and did the ordinance? He's sacrificing animals, and he's told, no, that's not right. You can't freelance an ordinance, and so we couldn't freelance polygamy either. Today, we don't perform animal sacrifices, and you can't equally go out and freelance polygamy. And so I don't read Section 132, verse 33 as actually being a command for polygamy because you can't do it without authority. So it brings us back to this authority question. And you may or may not know this, but the first several books I wrote on polygamy were on fundamentalist polygamy, where I've traced down. I have two websites, but
I've got
dealing
one of
with
them. I still need to read it.
okay. Well, it's the line. I wanted to understand how polygamists today justify their marriages based on Section 132, which emphasizes the one man over and over and over. And I don't believe Lauren Woolley or that these things can be authorized straight from heaven. I don't believe that, and so but that's probably another discussion. So
Okay. I want to transition to bringing this up. I've got a friend in my life who's sort of in a bit of a faith crisis and really struggling with polygamy and particularly D&C 132 and a few passages in there. And I think we both agree there are some tough passages in there, or maybe some language which is can be quite hard. And I personally still wrestle with some aspects of Doctrine and Covenants 132. But there's a passage, this is in reference to Emma, sort of referring that she needs to, cleave unto her husband Joseph, to stay herself, to cleave unto Joseph and none else, not to commit adultery. And then she's been told to, accept and receive Joseph and his plural wives, something along that language, or, be destroyed. And some might read that as that sounds really awful and threatening towards Emma being destroyed unless she accepts plural marriage and doesn't, make sure that she cleaves unto Joseph and none else. And how can we reconcile this coming from a loving, merciful God? How do you make sense of that? Do you see this as, in some ways that revelation is being transmitted through a human vessel and that articulating the language? So might be disturbed. Is this coming from Joseph? Is this coming from the Lord? How do we make sense of that? How do you make sense of that passage? Because I think the threats of damnation or destruction are it's hard language.
It is harsh, and again, it comes back to would God be that harsh with Emma? Of course, God can be harsh with any of us. We don't know, what level of sin or something we would need to do to. God starts with whispers and nice things and all, and then He gradually gives us earthquakes to try to get our attention. And with Emma, if you look at section 25, we find this is a lovely revelation. It's sweet, it's kind, it's gentle in its language. My late wife Laura gave a presentation where she researched this and drawn comparisons to 25 and section 132. And I mean, it's stark, and she's going to be destroyed. Now, the word destroyed here is ambiguous. What does that mean? Well, it just means she's not going to be exalted in the context, I would argue.
Right.
So even though it sounds very harsh, it's really just losing the blessings that are available. But clearly, it's very black and white, do it or don't, in contrast to the earlier revelation, which was given in 1830, section 25. And how do I handle that? I'm just saying I don't think we know the details of what's going on. The revelation talks about Emma not partaking of an offering, an offer. And there's been a lot of speculation on what is that offer. And I've written about this. And I at one point I thought the offer was a divorce, but doing a divorce at that time was a messy business. You had to have a reason. And she had reasons. It was polygamy, which the state would have seen as adultery. And so she could expose Joseph and get a divorce, but that exposing Joseph wasn't her real desire at that point. But what I really think it was, and incidentally, there's a funny thing about it was a wife swap. William
Yeah.
Law and Joseph were supposed to swap wives. Jane Law and Emma were going to swap wives.
I
It's
know
it's a
Graham
funny
Palmer
story.
talked about that.
Yeah, Joseph. I'm blocking on his last name, but he was a character. He wanted to marry Hiram's daughter, and when they said no way, he became an antagonist. But he was a prevaricator. But that was
That's
the
Joseph
story that they were.
Jackson.
I think so.
Oh,
Um, but I should look that up. But the point was that I think what it really was is that Emma was going to leave. We've got several accounts. When Emma and Joseph didn't get along, Emma would go to St. Louis. She'd escape to St. Louis, and then she'd come back. And she was making, according to one account, Joseph Robinson, that she was going to go back to her family in New York, and she was making these preparations. And I think Joseph was going to be okay with that. I miss you, Emma, but I've got my other wives, and we've got the church going forward, and God's commanding this. And then we get the revelation in July, and it's saying, don't do it. Don't do it. And the revelation also tells Joseph not to give up his property, which I'm guessing meant don't give a lot of church property to Emma or something. But we find the next day, William Clayton records in his journal that he signed over a number of lots to Emma, which ostensibly she could have used if something happened to Joseph or if they in fact did divorce or something. So we see a dynamic between Emma and Joseph, and William Clayton in another place a month later talks about a possible divorce. That's where the word comes from between them. So there's some pretty rough stuff going on between Joseph and Emma, and we have no knowledge practically of what is going on. And could that justify such direct language by God in this revelation, or is this just Joseph making it up in a harsh way? I don't know. If you read through it completely, the promises are still there to Emma completely, but it is requiring her to comply with something that we know she isn't wanting to. You remember what happened when he gives the revelation at Hiram's request. You remember what happened?
doesn't she say I don't believe a word in it?
Yeah. Yeah, Hiram takes it to Emma, reads it to her, comes back and says, I've never received such a,
Severe
a rebuke.
chastisement.
And Joseph just said, "You don't know him as well as I do." I mean, he's not surprised by this. So there's some heavy contention going on behind the scenes here. I'm not trying to justify the language per se, but this is God. He gets to say what he wants, and if he's trying to get our attention, if you look at section 43 again, I don't want to get too devotional, but he in section 43 of the Doctrine and Covenants, there's a revelation that talks about how God talks to us through the still small voice, and he sends his messengers to talk to us. But then things get ramped up, and there's whirlwinds, and there's earthquakes, and there's all these catastrophes, and God is trying to get our attention. This is kind of the way he moves. And if we see in Emma's life, if the contention is as problematic as it appears to be from some snippets that we have at our command now to understand, we could see where things are escalating with God, and we're no longer nice talking here. We're going to push this with a lot more emphasis, and that's why we find the harsher language. Anyway, I wouldn't be surprised in the end when we find out what's going on if that's actually what's happening behind the scenes.
Mm. I just want to read one last passage from D&C 132 before we get to just final wrapping up questions. This is from a friend of mine who is sort of in a bit of a faith crisis. So I'm just going to read this passage, just 2 verses. It says, "If any man espouse a virgin and desire to espouse another, and the first give her consent, and if he espouse the second, and there are virgins and have vowed to no other man, then is he justified. He cannot commit adultery, for they are given unto him, for he cannot commit adultery with that belongeth unto him, and to none else. And if he have 10 virgins given unto him by this law, he cannot commit adultery, for they belong to him, and they are given unto him, therefore is he justified." I think some might find that language referring to, a man desiring to marry a virgin, he's justified, and they're given and belong unto him, making women almost feel like in this revelation, like it sounds a bit like they're almost like property or belongings. And if a man's authorized to practice plural marriage, he can marry as many virgins as he desires. What's sort of like your thoughts on that? Do you think it's just the language that's used in that? Like, it's hard for me to believe that the Lord would see women or wives as sort of like property. I don't believe that. How do you make sense of those passages?
Well, I don't like them. I agree with whoever is raising the concern. I think these are problematic language. They're reflective, perhaps, of the time, this patriarchal uh, kind of approach to marriage and to women in general.
I suppose
I'm
it's
not
kind of
going to
language that
try.
you're given in marriage in a way. That's sort of like language.
Yeah, where clearly the man seems to be superior to the woman, and that she is. I mean, there's an idea that stems from this that was under the guise of adoption, that a man, if he could gain more plural wives, more biological children, or more sealed children. John D. Lee kind of promoted this, but in 1847, some of the apostles kind of embrace the same idea, trying to get people to be sealed to them. And there's an idea among fundamentalists today that, more wives you have, the greater your exaltation, which is not
Right.
traceable to Joseph or Brigham. Brigham had a lot of wives, but nobody is saying more wives is better. John Taylor, I think, had 7, but if 8 were going to give him more exaltation, he could have had 8. If 10 were going to give him more exaltation, it's not a doctrine of the church, even though some fundamentalist groups have embraced it. I don't believe that. And it was even, as I said, falsely attributed to some of the apostles, I think, tried to get people to be sealed to them in 1847. And the problem with that is they didn't have a temple. You can't have children adopted to you anywhere but in a temple. So all these promises are made in the late 1840s about how we're going to have these great, dynasties or something in eternity. But by the time they opened the St. George Temple in 1877, I think a lot of that had been forgotten. And this idea of more wives, more children, it went away, and I'm good riddance, I would say. So.
Mm. So the next question I have is with regards to the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. And some people argue or read D&C 132 as referring to the new and everlasting covenant of marriage. The context is with regards to him inquiring about polygamy. And some believe that, no, D&C 132, the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, is plural marriage, celestial plural marriage, and that the church is now redefining new and everlasting covenant because we don't practice polygamy anymore to celestial marriage. Can you address that? Like, what is the new and everlasting covenant marriage? Is it plural marriage? Is it celestial marriage? Has it been redefined? What's your take on that?
It's a great question, very important question, because and the answer is a little hard to say because between the 1840s and 1890, you find church leaders telling Brigham Young and others telling their congregations that God is commanding polygamy. I mean, it's out there. On the other hand, we have bishops that are bishops for 40 years and they're monogamists. And so we find this kind of wiggly standard that is sometimes being produced. But for those people who are living when polygamy is being taught as a commandment, they will see the new and everlasting covenant of marriage as plural marriage. But that is not what section 132 is saying. Now, verse 1 it acknowledges a question about how the ancient patriarchs had many wives and concubines. So the question is no doubt about polygamy. But and then God says in verse 4, I'm going to answer your question, Joseph. I'm going to reveal to you the new and everlasting covenant. Now, and by the way, if you don't obey it, you're going to be damned. All right. Okay. Joseph's going, you got my attention? Yeah. What is the new and everlasting covenant of marriage? And the question is it polygamy? Well, verses 19 and 20 give us the answer. Verse 19 begins, if a man marries a wife by my word, by proper authority, they live worthily, they shall they be gods because they have no end. They are set to their exaltation and glory in all things. Here we find described a monogamous couple who are being promised exaltation based upon being worthy and sealed by proper authority. That's why I keep coming back to this authority thing. So again, in section 132, we learn exaltation is obtainable by a monogamous couple. And so the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, if we go back to section 16 and 17, and I quoted this in part 1, but it talks about what people do who are breaking this law. And it says that these are people who are married, but or never married by the proper authority. They aren't sealed in an eternal marriage. And it says that when they're out of the world, they don't marry. They're not given in marriage. They are appointed as angels who live singly and separately without exaltation to all eternity. Right. So again, you break this, or you lose the blessing by not being sealed in the marriage. Polygamy is not part of this equation anywhere. The discussion is all about being sealed in a monogamous marriage by proper authority and living worthily. And You're so right, I argue.
It does say that in a couple of verses. It does say a man marry a wife. It doesn't say wives in that passage.
Yeah. And so this is where we go back to the verse about go ye do the works of Abraham. And people are trying to say that verse is commanding polygamy. But again, it doesn't. We talked about that. The command is to do the works of Abraham, but you can't that's not freelance polygamy. You have to have authorized polygamy. So if the one man holding the keys is not allowing it, then there's no way to do it, even if we're convinced we needed to. You can't freelance that ordinance, any ordinance for that matter.
And what would you say to those people who say that there's statements from leaders of the church who, I think there's one from Brigham Young where he talks about those who, become gods or the sons of God are those who enter into polygamy, and that they might say that there's some statements from early church prophets that those who would be exalted would be only polygamists. What would be your response to that? I know that there's another statement from Brigham Young where he says, or those who are polygamists, at least in their faith. So it seems like at the time, it was because it was commanded that people had to accept polygamy as a doctrine, as a teaching. But as you said, not all males in the church were polygamists. But did that mean that they would be denied exaltation? What's your response? How would you address that?
Yeah, these are real popular quotes with our fundamentalist friends. And the irony is both of those quotes that you just mentioned from Brigham Young are in the same discourse. He first says you will be a polygamist at least in your faith, and then he later says he contradicts it. He says you must literally be it. Now, Lejeune Carruth, who knows Taylor's shorthand, has transcribed George Watt's shorthand for that particular discourse. And what it appears Brigham is actually saying is that if you have an opportunity to be a polygamist and you're commanded to do it and you don't, then you will not be exalted, or then you'll have less blessings. I mean, he's saying that, yeah, you must be a polygamist if you have the opportunity. And Brigham, of course, was very adamant that he had to authorize every plural marriage. He excommunicated W. Phelps because he married plural wives without Brigham's permission. He excommunicated W. Phelps when he found out about it, and then rebaptized him the next day and kind of restored him. But as an emphasis on the fact that there's one man who has these keys, that's what Brigham did. You cannot freelance these ordinances. And so the interesting thing is I've done a deep dive, and there's a pamphlet actually out published by, I think it was Ogden Kraut, where they try to find all of the so-called commands to practice polygamy, or statements where a church leader is saying all exalted men are polygamists or something like that. There's no such statement. You can find some things from a few of the apostles giving their own opinion, but the one man holding the keys has never said that all exalted beings are polygamists, that all men in eternity are polygamists. And frankly, I don't believe either of those statements either. There's another real popular one that comes from Joseph F. Smith, where he says people are saying that you can have as much exaltation if you're not a polygamist, and I want to protest that. But he goes on to say that you can't live polygamy unless it's commanded. And if you try to live it when it's not commanded, or you try to do it without authority, you will not be blessed for it. So people are excerpting just the part of these two discourses that they like, and not looking at the big context, which clearly describes people doing what we are doing, people doing what they did in the Book of Mormon, which is living monogamy to the best of their ability. And then these other things will be taken care of in eternity. So.
Okay, so if I'm understanding right, you're saying that there's other statements from leaders of the church who you're saying that you don't have to be a polygamist in order to be exalted, but they did view polygamy as it was a commandment at this time up until 1890, and of course there was some practice until 1904, which we won't get into, but that would have always been part of obeying for the new and everlasting covenant of marriage, because plural marriage was commanded at that time, but really it's more celestial marriage, and those people that weren't practicing plural marriage, they wouldn't be seen as they're denied exaltation. But it's more if you flat out rejected polygamy as a doctrine. Is that probably more of a clarification?
That was a great summary. Yeah, that's how I understand it. People use the terms ambiguously while polygamy was commanded, 1840s to 1890. But if you look at Section 132, it's clearly offering exaltation to those who are living worthily and sealed by proper authority in a monogamous relationship. And then what's interesting is I'm a student of the fundamentalist literature, the polygamists today. They don't often quote verses 19 and 20 of Section 132 because it's clear they'll put brackets there saying this really means polygamy, but it really doesn't, or they'll put an asterisk saying this really is referring to polygamy, but the verbiage that's there is clearly offering polygamy, offering monogamists all the blessings of exaltation.
Right. I've heard some people argue, because it seems like there is definitely, it's undisputed, there was a revelation received in July 1843. I think we've shown very conclusively that it was Doctrine and Covenants 132. Who was it that later said? Leonard Sobey and Ebenezer Robinson said, yeah, that's what was read at the High Council meeting. But some, I think, polygamy deniers, or some people that still want to hold on to those verses about monogamous celestial marriage, believe that this was revelation from Joseph, but then the rest, the plural marriage part, the polygamy parts, was later added from Brigham Young. What's your thoughts on that? Because it seems, as I read it, it's all part of one revelation, but what's your thoughts on the celestial marriage part? Could have came from Joseph, but then the polygamy stuff was later added in.
Yeah, this has got a lot of traction with some of the denialist groups, that the Section 132 is really three revelations And we notice verse 1 talks about plurality of wives, but polygamy is not mentioned again till verses 32, 34.
Hmm.
And so they want to say, well, that eternal marriage stuff is just that's from Joseph, and then this other was added later by people. Problem with that theory, the reality is that I think many of us think that Joseph may have received this in sections over time or something. I mean, the
Right.
last section is clearly talking about Joseph Smith's intimate relationships with Emma and with others in his circle of friends, in polygamy insiders, and it's
Right.
very
It's a current
specific to that time and
revelation.
place.
Yes, he wouldn't have received that in, the early 1830s. That would
Right,
have been the revelation he
exactly.
received. Right.
But the biggest problem with that theory is the document, the Kingsbury copy. It has a very solid provenance to July 12th, 1843, and it's one document. And to try to say, well, you look at it, and we saw it earlier. I brought up the slide with all the pages. It's a solid single dictation. William Clayton said it was a single dictation, and this is an exact copy. Kingsbury did the same thing. Eyewitnesses, depositions. I mean, you just don't get any better documentation for this being one continuous document, 30, what is it, 3,200 words or something, that Joseph just recounted, and it was given once. But how he received it, we don't know. We can speculate, and people
Mhm.
like to do that. Some people say we know he got it in different stages. Well, we think he did. I mean, there's good indications he might have, but the first part of it, the first 30 verses, to me, describe eternal marriage, which is his greatest teaching. His zenith doctrine that he ever revealed is found in that section. So people who want to throw away section 132 are throwing away his I think, most his highest, principle that he ever described. So,
Well, I was going to my follow-up question because I know that there's probably some Latter-day Saints who might reject D&C 132, but they still believe Joseph was a prophet, still believe in the church. And it seems for me that like plural marriage and celestial marriage, that we believe, which is a really important doctrine in our church, being sealed, a man and his wife and their children for eternity, they seem intertwined in that revelation. And if you reject plural marriage and then sort of deny Doctrine and Covenants 132, can you still hold on to celestial marriage? I don't really see how you can if it seems to be coming from the same revelation.
well, and it gets worse, of course, as we talked about in part one. What do we do with the prophets after Joseph? If we want to throw out section 132 and say it didn't come from Joseph, well, we got Brigham and John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, Lorenzo Snow, eyewitnesses saying Joseph was doing the polygamy. I mean, everything just falls apart. But for those who are struggling with plural marriage, and I get it, I don't blame you. Plural marriage is a struggle. Let me just say, my research, my many hours dealing with these documents and these ideas, Joseph Smith was not perfect, but he was worthy. There is nothing I have found in here, in any of the documents, that would suggest that Joseph was a libido-driven fraud or that libido drove this. I don't believe that. The people who were around Joseph Smith, maybe I could just interject. There are two ridiculous positions that are advanced by critics. One is the way they portray the people right around Joseph Smith, the polygamy insiders in Nauvoo, but the people who knew Joseph Smith personally. Okay, they portray them as being so stupid they couldn't figure out that he was a libido-driven fraud. Well, these people were just as skeptical as you and me. If Joseph Smith were doing things that made this look like libido-driven process, they would have dumped Joseph. Most of them. There may have been some that were that gullible, but most of them would not. And when William Law, and we remember William, he does break with Joseph, but he takes the revelation home. And he says it turned him and his wife upside down. And he's thinking about it. And a journal entry from January 1st, 1844, he says he almost embraced it. So you see, it takes him weeks and months to finally say, I don't think this is the real thing. If this were the simplistic pedophile, seeking more sexual opportunities version of Joseph that so many of the critics portray, the people around him would have picked up on that in a second. William Law would have picked up on it and dumped Joseph the second he heard about it. That's not what's happening here. What's going on is much more complex. This plural marriage revelation that and principle that Joseph is restoring here is very believable. William Law almost believed it, but lots of others who were just as skeptical did believe it and participate. And the one thing that I found in my research was that there were lots of reports of visions, dreams, of angelic visitations in Nauvoo at this time, validating this principle and helping people agree to it because they were so skeptical and they didn't want to do it. And again, it's much more complex. Let's not be too simplistic as we describe the people around Joseph Smith. The other ridiculous position, and maybe I shouldn't use the derogatory term ridiculous, but less persuasive position of critics, is the idea that Joseph Smith had the intellectual ability to dictate the Book of Mormon, and that will be our next podcast sometime next year, hopefully. But anyway, I just want to interject those two things. When we start portraying Joseph doing crazy stuff to get sex, remember that Eliza Snow and Zina Huntington and John Taylor and Joseph Kingsbury, these were men, and Joseph Noble, these were men who were very skeptical, and they would have picked up on this simplistic nonsense that's being portrayed as Joseph's behavior. So,
no, good point. I have just a couple, two or three sort of like final questions that I'd maybe like us to finish more on a positive note, maybe talking about maybe some people's spiritual experiences. Because I think it's important to take those into account as you're going through plural marriage. I don't have a testimony of polygamy, and I still wrestle a lot with it. But I think it's important whenever you read their accounts that a lot of people wrestled with it as well at the time when they were presented with it, and they really, really struggled over it. And if you're somebody who believes in spiritual experiences, you need to take into account some people who claim, like you said, angelic visitations or dreams or spiritual experiences, and then them becoming avid defenders of the practice as well. But I just want to, before we get to that, I want to ask just a couple more questions that my listeners have. One listener says, since the church has turned 180 degrees or turned away from like past teachings in the past that are either considered false doctrine or no longer taught, such as like Adam God theory or some of the teachings with regards to like race in the priesthood, the curse of Cain, or blood atonement, why couldn't the church consider polygamy false doctrine if it has with others? Like, why would it have to fall apart? You've kind of already touched on this, but what would be your quick answer to that?
well, the examples that you gave are problematic. What was it? Blood atonement? This is not. I did a little research on that once, trying to find one person who'd been blood atoned under the direction of Joseph Smith or Brigham Young, and it didn't happen. I mean, it's just such a great idea that the critics keep talking about it, but I can't find it actually ever being commanded or directed by a church leader. So I would not consider
That's kind of
that,
a
whatever
relief.
it means, as being a church doctrine. The first one, Adam God, was never a church doctrine. Brigham, he did teach it at times. He didn't, and people want to say every word out of Brigham's mouth is a revelation and all that stuff. But Orson Pratt never accepted it. The highest quorums are not agreeing on these ideas, no matter how widely they may have been spread. And the Adam God theory contradicts the scriptures given through Joseph Smith. And we can have a big discussion on all of this, but the point is, this is not a church doctrine. Now, the element of race and priesthood, I'll be honest with you, I'm not an expert on that. And it does make me uncomfortable. At the same time, we realize that we're dealing with people with their own biases that took years to get past those. So I don't find the comparisons to be highly compelling to me. But could we give up polygamy? This has been suggested by some people in books that have been written. Of course we can't. And because of not because it's we could disallow it, but what do we do with Brigham Joseph? Or I'm sorry, Brigham and Lorenzo and Wilford and John Taylor? What do we do with all of their actions, all of their teachings, and everything? We're taking away the next next four presidents of the church, and then every other one after that's sustaining things that they did. I mean, the church just falls apart when we look at authority, when we look at the teachings of these individuals. So it may sound like a quick, easy thing. Oh yeah, maybe I'll believe that Joseph is a monogamist, but it's a halfway house to apostasy, and we'll lose our ability to sustain the keys held by President Nelson. So
And some have argued, I think this is kind of a minority position, not as prevalent as either Joseph being like a fraud libido driven or Joseph not being a polygamist, but there's some people that have taken the point of view, similar to the quote, from William Marks, the last few weeks of Joseph's life. Joseph apparently said that, polygamy was a mistake and he shouldn't have introduced the doctrine. And they either interpret that one, Joseph could have been a fallen prophet, or he was still a prophet, but the polygamy revelation was a mistake. Maybe there was an angel, but it was a wrong angel, and that plural marriage isn't of God. What's sort of like your thoughts maybe on the William Marks statement? Because I believe you responded and addressed to that Joseph approved some marriages after that statement. So there's maybe some, you could call into question the credibility of that quote, but it is, I guess, still a data point. But those people who might say that maybe polygamy was a mistake or wasn't a revelation from God, but Joseph could have either still been a prophet or maybe he was a fallen prophet.
Again, a good question. It's a good question because I've heard it many times, usually from sisters. But the idea is that Joseph Smith let his libido get away from him and just went on with polygamy without God's sanction. A variant of that is that the reason we have polygamy is not because it was God's idea in the first place, but Joseph asked about it and says, "Hey, I want to do polygamy. God, can I do that?" And then we have all that. The official narrative that Joseph delivered denies both of those. He said an angel appeared three times. The first was in the summer of 1834, commanding it, which would give us, the Fanny Algor thing. And then the angel came a second time and made Nauvoo introduce it. But then Joseph's just doing these eternity only non-sexual sealings. So he comes a third time saying, Joseph, do the real thing, the full meal deal on this polygamy, like Abraham did. And so it's taking three commands from him. Joseph didn't want to do it. That's what we're hearing. And I have in my book at least a half a dozen people who are relating how Joseph didn't want to do it. He could see how hard it was going to be. He could see it was going to hurt Emma, and he didn't want to do it. Now, that's not the narrative that people usually think about. They envision this libido-driven fraud. But that's what the people around Joseph were convinced, that he didn't want to do it and that God wanted him to for reasons that we don't know. It's a tough thing, and we don't have a good explanation for it. So I have to reject those ideas. I believe that the narrative of the church. Again, I don't find in Joseph Smith any actions. There are accusations from critics who are far removed from the circle, but the people who are involved are finding this to be a religious practice. I did a study on the 35 wives. By my count, he had 35 women sealed to him. Some of these, probably a third, are eternity only, but that's still a large number. I followed them after the martyrdom, and there are half a dozen or so who leave the church. There's not a single woman who comes out and looks back and says it was just a sham. And I felt like chattel. We talked about the language. I don't like it, and it's very much of the time, but that's not an excuse that treats women as something less than men. That's not good. That's wrong, and it's unfortunate. But we don't find any of these women later relating that feeling that this was just Joseph Smith looking for sex. It's not in any of the 35. I traced them right out to their deaths. Most of them stayed in the church as active Latter-day Saints, and many of them left statements. But even the 5 or 6 that left, none of them said, "Oh yeah, I remember." And these are women that if they'd have had that narrative, there are so many anti-Mormon outlets that would have loved to have published it. They would not have had any problem, publishing a letter or a full expose if that was their later feelings. But they didn't. They didn't do that.
No, that's a good point. I like the quote that you presented earlier from, it was Emily Partridge as well, about Joseph's character as well, because if Joseph was acting a bit like a creep and making advances on women, that would be quite troubling. But it's important to take into account that none of the wives after ever speak against his character, which you should at least take into account what the wives have to say. This next question, this is probably the toughest question. I don't think really you'll not have the answer to this. I don't think anyone will, but maybe if you have any thoughts on this. This is a question that I've wrestled over is, we believe in a God who is, loving and just and merciful. And it's almost reconciling this commandment, this practice of polygamy, which seems just so unjust and almost unloving and hard. And while some people had some very good spiritual experiences and it brought the saints together, there also seemed to be a lot of hardship and a lot of heartbreak. And it's just reconciling why God would command this. I know you've said before we don't know why, but do you have any thoughts for people who feel like there's no way a good loving God could command something that seems just so not good and not
So
loving or
unfair.
fair?
I've been asked that many times. I have an answer. I'll share it. I'm not sure it's convincing. But what I do is give the analogy that right now at this moment, there's a baby being born in Zimbabwe to abject poverty at the same time a baby's being born in Boston to privilege, to the same time a baby's being born in Idaho to a devout Latter-day Saint family. And how could a God be fair or just in allowing that level of disparity in where these people are born? And all I'm doing is I'm illustrating we can't judge God. And if we feel that something like polygamy is too hard, that God would never do it, then why would he send a baby to Zimbabwe? I mean, there's things going on. We're only looking at the second act of a three-act play. And we can use natural logic to try to judge supernatural things. It won't work. It won't work. And we're just going to come away frustrated. The other side of it, this is again a little devotional, but remember, we believe that Adam fell and that we all fell with him and we all chose to fall. We chose God's plan that Christ was implementing. And by doing that, we agreed to come to an earth with briars and noxious weeds and sweat of our brow and trials. And if God gives us a trial we think is unfair, I mean, is that a reason to believe God wouldn't do it? I don't think that logic within the context of the gospel is very good. I don't think that's very convincing to say that God would never command something as hard as polygamy, or would ever command Lehi and his family to travel through the wilderness and come to America. I mean, there's hard things that God does command, and but like I said, in Nauvoo, I found lots of these women are having dreams and angel visits and visions and things that is sustaining this. So God is there kind of sustaining this very difficult thing because he knows it's difficult, is one way to read at least those types of accounts.
And whenever I was going through polygamy, I remember coming across this source, and it's late, and I believe it's coming from William Law's son, Richard Law. I can't remember the context. I think it was some sort of an interview. But I actually thought there was some credibility to this statement as I read it, because I don't think he would be biased to defend Joseph, but he related seeing William Law and Joseph Smith having this sort of like this conversation, and both of them were in tears. William Law was in tears, sort of begging Joseph to not practice polygamy. It's going to destroy the church. And you could see and feel his emotion. And then he described Joseph also being in tears as well. And he said that Joseph seemed very sincere and pretty much said that we have to practice it. I've been commanded. It's a true principle. And I could almost envision that sort of conversation taking place. We know William Law struggled and then opposed polygamy. But reading that's probably perhaps the way that I would view how Joseph felt about his sincerity, that he felt that he had to restore the practice, that it was a revelation. Other people had spiritual experiences, and obviously that is faith in a way, because you could say maybe Joseph was just being a really good actor and lying. But as I read that, I thought there was maybe some credibility to that. And I obviously view Joseph as religiously sincere and sincere about his revelations. I don't know if you've any thoughts on that quote, but that was something that kind of stuck out to me in my series, that I see some sincerity in Joseph Smith in practicing polygamy, as difficult as it is.
Well, and it's a wonderful quote because it's Joseph does give a very consistent message that this is from God. And we Brigham Young said, is quoted as saying that some people said Joseph Smith, or he says Joseph Smith was worn out by polygamy. Brigham said, some say that he had given it up, but I didn't know that he had. And kind of coming back to William Marks saying that Joseph was going to give it up and all. I think that's wishful thinking. I think William Marks and Emma were very hopeful that Joseph was going to give it up. The William Marks was saying that he wanted the Nauvoo High Council to try the polygamists and stuff. That makes no sense because the apostles, half of them were polygamists, and they wouldn't have been under the jurisdiction of the High Council, and Joseph knew everyone as far as we can tell. He authorized each one. So William Marks, I think, is not really able to portray the idea that Joseph had given it up along those lines. And his commitment to it is related by Richard Law in that account, that they were weeping and had their arms around each other. And Joseph is just saying,
Yeah.
I can't give it up. This is from God, is really the message that Joseph consistently portrays by the eyewitnesses, those who knew him. So,
Yeah. Brian, I think I'd like to just finish with one last question. I think this has been a really great discussion. Part one focused a lot more on the historical aspect. Part two has maybe been addressing more of the scriptural or doctrinal arguments, some historical things as well. But my last question would be, what advice would you give to someone who is struggling and wrestling over polygamy, either doctrinally, things with Doctrine and Covenants 132, Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy? You've read all the documents on it. You are one of the living experts on this. I think there are some messy and troubling things as well, but there's also a lot more context to things than what you might hear about on the internet or from critical sites. But for someone who's really struggling over this issue, what advice would you give?
well, first off, my heart would go out to them because I get it. I think I do. I've watched this in loved ones, people who have struggled mightily with this idea. And maybe I shouldn't share this, but my late wife Laura, we got married, and she didn't know. I told her she was marrying into polygamy because we got married in 2013, just shortly after my books had just come out. So they were going through reviews, and I was going around and getting hammered by critics and having to defend. But she didn't know really very much about Joseph Smith and plural marriage. And so my sweet Laura is reading my books, and she's having her own little faith crisis with it. And I'm not sure before she passed away in 2022 that it was fully resolved for her. And yet I've come to believe that it's okay. She didn't have to before she died. And so, for those that are challenged by this, understandably so, you could do maybe I could tell you the story. I had a member of my family write me a letter when I was researching this back in 2007. And she said, Brian, don't get involved with this. I think Joseph just made a mistake, but just let it be. He repented. He's still a prophet. We can believe in him. That was her theory. And I just looked at it, and I'm going, this doesn't square with anything that I'm learning historically. So I just kind of set it aside. But I had people ask me, are you worried that you're going to find out something about Joseph that is going to shake your testimony in him as a prophet? And to be honest with you, I never did. And let me tell you why. And it goes back to what I'm studying now. I believe Joseph could not create the Book of Mormon using his own intellect. Um, uh, I just believed that before researching it. In 1829, he didn't have the skills. And I've been researching it for 10 years. And I believe that the naturalist, the atheist, the secularist, the empiricist do not have a rational explanation for the literary skills Joseph Smith demonstrated almost daily as he dictated the Book of Mormon. And that statement is going to be a theme in the book, but I'm going to show that that's the case. But the take home is that the Book of Mormon is beyond his ability. He was a prophet in 1829. And as I said, I haven't found anything in his behavior, even though I don't like polygamy, that would make him be less than a prophet. And so if somebody's struggling with this, maybe do what Laura did. Just don't worry about it. I'm sorry. Just go forward and get the Book of Mormon in your heart and the miracle that it is, and let these things just sit. And don't worry about them. You don't have to resolve this now. It'll all become clear. So I apologize for being emotional there, Stephen. This is so long that people probably aren't going to get to this part of podcast anyway, so maybe nobody will hear it. But really, I think these things don't have to be resolved. But just go back to the Book of Mormon. It's a testament. He was a prophet. We can believe in him and in the church that he organized.
No, that's beautiful. And thank you for being emotional and personal as well, vulnerable about that. And I really appreciate those words and that advice as well. And I also want to say that while polygamy is doctrinally and historically, there are some controversial, troubling things, and I too feel, in light of my own faith journey, I have a lot of empathy and compassionate understanding to those who struggle with it, to those who wrestle with it, to those who have come to a different conclusion. I feel like I empathize with it. I really do appreciate the work you've done and your wife, Laura Hales, and other people. I think transparency is helpful, even though there's sometimes things which have been like, oh, but it's good sometimes to confront and to be aware. And I appreciate that you have confronted the subject as a faithful believer as well, and to have more contextual understanding as well. And like you said, the Book of Mormon being that keystone to our faith and our testimony. And I appreciate you coming on for the great work you've done on polygamy, on the Book of Mormon. You're going on a mission soon, so I wish you all the best in your mission, and hopefully we can collaborate again when your book comes out in the Book of Mormon and future topics again. But thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me, and thanks to anybody who listened this long. Appreciate it.
Yeah, listeners who have stayed with us, thanks for watching. Give this a like, comment underneath as well. Share this with other people as well. I think this is an important subject. And check out the links in the description as well. We'll link Brian's article, or it's not an article, it's your presentation, whatever you would call it, that you have on. Yeah, I will put that. And don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Mormonism with Murph. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.